What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. These battle lines being drawn, nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner from the Robust Opposition, coming to you from the Moscone Center in San Francisco. I am going to introduce my two guests, Dallas Fowler and Dina Becker, both of whom were Bernie delegates with me and in Philadelphia, and we're still at it 3 years later. And I first talked to these guys about this idea at the Bernie Sanders rally in Grand Park. Unfortunately, the interview with their rationale did not come out, so I'm going to give them an opportunity to explain again why they think that Bernie Sanders running with Kamala Harris as his vice presidential pick would be a winning ticket. And I again want to say as a caveat that I am one who has organized a protest against Kamala Harris. So I do not like the woman. I do not think she would be good for president. But I have to concede that after hearing your argument, it makes some sense to me from a political operative's point of view, not from my idealistic, personal preference. My personal preference would be to see him with Warren, or to see him with Tulsi, or to see him with Nina.
Yeah, I agree with you, actually. My personal preference would be to have a Bernie Warren ticket. That would probably be my first choice. But we can't play checkers right now. We have to play chess. We have to be very, very specific in what moves we're making. And I see a Bernie Harris ticket as, for lack of better words, somewhat satisfying both sides of the Democratic spectrum. And in some ways, in a lot of ways, actually, building in its own system of checks and balances. You know, I think that they could have a lot to offer each other. I think Bernie could teach her a lot of things, and I think she could learn a lot from Bernie.
Yeah. Why don't you? Okay, what can she teach Bernie?
Well, I'll just say this. Kamala Harris is the first woman attorney general for the state of California. We have over 49 million residents in this state. The West Coast is California. The rest of the nation looks to California in terms of our policies and how forward we can be. And I think as forward as California is somewhat as half as how forward the rest of the nation is going to be. And so this is often the test ground for those types of policies. And Kamala has had a strong track record of upholding the law, and she knows the law very well. And I think if anyone has watched her in any of her committee hearings, from the judiciary to interviewing Attorney General Barr in the last few weeks, they know that as a former prosecutor and attorney general, she understands the law well. Not only that, but she is able to get to the root of the issue. And she also is able to present solutions for those issues. And I think that's what's important. But when you have that type of support from a state of this populace, and then you have someone like a Senator Sanders that has not just Vermont, but a good base in terms of the Eastern Seaboard. I think you have a good match in terms of getting people not only just from the progressive and more moderate side of spectrums of our party, but also from the states that say, hey, okay, I see some that looks like me. I see somebody that is a woman that covers that aspect. And then I see somebody that's going to champion for me for our fight for 15, our fight for Medicare for all, our fight to make public college more accessible for everyone. I think that is the perfect match for me. Now, it may not make sense to everyone else. I love Elizabeth Warren. I think no one who aligns more with my values than Elizabeth Warren. And I actually this weekend, having a chance to meet and hear more from Amy Klobuchar, I really like her as well. Now, I don't know all of her background, all of that, and I'm sure you can't wait to tell me, Lauren. But I do know that no matter what, we have some great Dems at play. Even hearing from Congressman Eric Swalwell today, we have some great Dems out there, and no matter what, whoever ends up in the top, what I say is, I know my Kamala folks don't want me to say Bernie Kamala. They want to hear Kamala first. Bernie folks don't even want me to say Kamala. But the reality of this is we have to be very strategic in terms of how we take this seat back.
I interviewed Rich Pelletier on my show, and he was Bernie's deputy campaign manager in 2016. And we both, prior to the interview, we both talked about how we thought it would be really great and novel coming out of the box for Bernie to run with a vice presidential candidate. One, to kind of say that, don't worry, for those of you who think I'm too old, here's the person who's going to be the next in command. And two, because if he picked we both kind of liked Nina Turner when we were having our conversation, then he would check off all those identity boxes that we're talking about, except for the establishment identity box, because Nina Turner is very progressive like Bernie. So if we want to get the Hillary supporters, we would go with somebody more like Kamala Harris. It's always been traditional that after the nominee is chosen, that's when they announce who their vice president is. But don't you think, and if you do agree, that he should do it beforehand so that he would be, it would have to be at a time when she knows she's not going to win. So would it be after the debates? Would it be after the first primary? When do you see making this announcement?
I don't know, I don't know that happens. I think we're going to see these candidates all the way through, especially a candidate like a Kamala Harris. She is very still well liked throughout states, and there's a lot of states that still haven't had opportunity to hear from her. And I think that they are going to go all the way up through convention. Now, some of these other folks, I hope, come to their senses and fall off. 1% if you don't have a certain amount of funds raised. I think we have to deal with the reality here, but they are presenting themselves as wonderful potential cabinet members, and I think that's important as well. But I think we see a Kamala all the way to convention. I think she sees it through. I hope she sees it through, because that's what we need in women candidates. I hope Elizabeth Warren goes as far as she can. And we know Bernie's going to be there. But what I tell some of my more establishment friends, as you call them, is that Senator Sanders somehow comes out with a plurality of delegates. Our new DNC rules changing over. And then the superdelegates come in and weigh in on the second round of balloting. And they change that plurality to another nominee. Either if that nominee is not nominating Bernie Sanders as their VP, we have a problem, and Trump is going to be in for another 4 years. So get ready for it, folks. Love it or hate it. If you don't have, I also think the same thing about a Joe Biden. Yeah. Joe Biden, I think we still get another 4 years. Yeah. It's not the answer with who the new American majority is. And that's who even Kimberly Ellis talks about, which is single women, people of color, millennials. These are the people who we have to get out the vote. And we can't keep placating to this moderate to conservative aspect. We have got to come back and get our people here, because we're losing them on one side of our party. And so that's the reality of it. That's the truth that I tell. But I think Bernie still has a wonderful shot at this. I think Kamala still has a wonderful shot. So let's see what happens in Iowa.
I think you were being a little kind to Kamala about her record. I mean, she can go on TV and she can grill someone really well, but everybody knows that she did not prosecute Steve Mnuchin for foreclosure fraud when it was recommended by her staff, and the reason everybody knows is he contributed to her attorney general's campaign, and then when she didn't prosecute him, he contributed to her Senate campaign. everybody also knows that she was very tough on African American, people, whether they were truants, parents of truants, whether they were holding possession of small amounts of marijuana. She incarcerated a lot of African Americans. Even though she now speaks against mass incarceration. On Twitter, there's a lot of actually black women who are very much against her for this because they know her record as a prosecutor was not progressive. So we can't just be assured, like identity politics, that all black women or all African Americans, for that matter, are going to vote for her simply because she's African American. What do you think of that?
That's 100% true what you said. I know you don't agree. See, this is exactly why I said there could be a lot of things that she could learn from Bernie, and that his influence may help sway her or correct some of the things that she did. Because she did do some things that, a lot of people are still upset about. But, people grow and people learn. And, I do like her as a person. And I would love to see her become more progressive and learn from her past.
But when people talk about her record on being against the death penalty, Kamala was against the death penalty. She took major hits from law enforcement. I got hits from law enforcement for supporting her for Attorney General. So I know she did this. However, the law of the land, the law of the state of California was still have the death penalty. And so she still had to uphold that. That was her job. It wasn't something that made her happy. It wasn't something that she did gleefully. However, she did her job. And so when we walk a very fine line as elected officials, and when you get to a slippery slope where someone decides when and when it's not okay to do your job and uphold our Constitution, you swear an oath no matter what. So when as a commissioner for the city of Los Angeles, I swear an oath to the state of California's Constitution and to the U.S. Constitution. And you have to uphold those things, whether you agree with them or not. That's what you're sworn to do. Now, when you talk about the truancy, let's get to that, because when we actually look at who was actually prosecuted, it's a very, very small number, and the truancy rate was ridiculous, and she cut it in more than half, almost by 70%. Those kids were in school, and that's what mattered. And sometimes you have to set policies where they may seem like they're harsh, but the reality of who actually got prosecuted is small. So I can't use that against her. And I think a lot of folks are just willing to drag African American woman far more than they're willing to drag a white male. And I love Bernie Sanders. I love Bernie, but Bernie has some stuff too that I do not agree with that have taken place in Vermont, especially with communities of color. So we don't want to go out to all of the things that's wrong with these folks. We need to focus on what's right and how we can come together and win this White House.
Okay, well, first of all, let me tell you that when it came to Proposition 8, she chose not to enforce that law. When it was gay marriage, and she didn't agree with that, she chose not to enforce that. And that is, I'll get you the site when we're done with this, because I can't speak fluently to it, but this is an exception that was made. The other thing was there were people that were exculpatory evidence for people who were in jail that she refused to hear. Then there was...
Lauren,
what?
I know you can go all night on her.
Well, because I
want you to go all night on the things that Bernie has done equally. If you're going to do one side, you've got to do the other.
Here's the thing, Bernie, you can't. Here's the thing, Bernie. A lot of people have said this about Bernie in the state of Vermont. First of all, Bernie is a senator. He was a federal officer. He's responsible for things that happen on the federal level, not for things that happen on the local level. She was a law enforcement. Yeah, and he was a great mayor. What did he do as mayor that people objected to?
Okay, so we have some instances of when he was in the Congress. It doesn't matter that all politics is local. Let's be clear. The decisions that are being made in Washington versus the decisions that are being made in Sacramento still the local level. And there was a case of toxic dumping in a people of color majority minority communities that they fought against it and they couldn't get the response. And I always listen to what the story is of African Americans in your community. And I feel the same way about Pete Buttigieg, or however you say his last name. I'm not trying to disrespect your name, sir, but I feel the same way. The story of African Americans in your community, tell me the story of African Americans, or what their story is going to be with you nationally. And so if we don't get a handle on that, we have to hold everybody accountable for the same things. We can't just go in and rip somebody to shreds and then say, oh, I'm ready for this candidate now. That doesn't work. That dog doesn't hunt. And if we want the White House, we can't play this game anymore. Well, so all of these things that all you did wrong, we need to get to what you did right and what we can improve upon, because that's not going to be the narrative that helps us get the White House. Otherwise, we're going to stay with the crazy chicken shit in the house.
I want to talk about reparations, because I had a conversation, a bunch of us super volunteers from 2016, some of whom are still continuing with our revolution and Bernie 2020, had a conversation with Ro Khanna today about some things that we think could be improved in California, especially now that they've hired some local staffers. They've hired 8 staffers. And one of the things that I mentioned, getting beyond just California, was reparations, because we know that Bernie said 3 years ago, he said it was divisive and he wasn't for it. And this year he's been heard saying, what does that mean? And I sent a text to Nina and I said, look, Bernie's got to change his answer on that, because times have changed, and there's a lot of people who are supporting reparations. I know a white guy who boycotted going to the rally in Grand Park because he didn't like Bernie's stance. And he says, I'm boycotting Bernie rallies until he gets a better stance on reparations. And I said, so I looked this up. I went to the ADOS, which stands for African Descendants of Slaves website. And I went to the Black Lives Matter website and looked up their position on this. And it's not just a cash payment to African Americans. It actually has to do with things like giving aid to historically black colleges and universities, giving aid to black businesses, giving aid to people who are buying homes, because there were racial covenants and redlining. So kind of making up in terms of certain policy areas for past injustices. And I said, look, if Bernie took a look at these lists, he would be in favor of a lot of these things. He already is talking about free college and health care for all, which, as we know, would disproportionately help African Americans. So I said he's got to go meet with people, because just like I tried to encourage, and of course nobody was answering my emails back in July of 2016, trying to encourage him to go to the BLM convening in July and meet with Patrice, and I said, he's got to go on the stage and let somebody else speak. Bernie always speaks so much. He needs to listen. And we know that after Netroots Nation, when he walked in there and they were protesting, and he said, you invited me here to speak, but if you don't want to hear what I have to say, I'll just leave. And I'm going like this, oh no, Bernie, you didn't just say that. And then, of course, he course corrected in Seattle. He backed off when they protested him and let those 2 women have the microphone. So what do you think Bernie ought to do about reparations?
Well, it's funny you brought that question up in that statement about him needing to listen, because I was contacted by members of his campaign by email back on, I believe it was May 3rd. And they asked me, my opinions. And I gave them a whole lot of them. And the thing that I proposed to them was actually holding somewhat like a town hall or round table, where Bernie wasn't there to give a speech, but he was there to listen. And I gave them a list of people that are highly respected in the black community, both progressive people and conservative people from economics, BLM, women's groups. I mean, I didn't hear back.
Oh.
I did not get a response. And I'm hoping that, it's because we're in a little whirlwind right now with the elections here in California. And so I'm just going to take a little break, but I'm going to get back to them next week,
Well, don't worry.
once the dust settles, and I'll be like, hello, did you see my email? The thing about reparations is you have to ask the people what they want first and foremost. And that answer to that question is going to be very diverse because we're not a monolithic group. We all don't want a check. Some of us want 40 acres and a Tesla, you know. Exactly. I've used it. I've already used the hashtag. I want my 40 acres and a Tesla. It's different for everyone, but you have to have people at the table and you have to listen to what it is we want. That's the only way that this country is going to move forward, is if we actually deal with that issue of slavery, Jim Crow, segregation. We have to deal with it. And the only way to deal with it is through reparations.
Yeah. Bernie did do a town hall in Atlanta, and one of the people who asked the question, I'm going to have this guy on my show, Gregory Robert McKelvey. He used to live in Portland. I think he was the Bernie delegate from Portland, Oregon. Now he lives in Atlanta. And he asked that question, and Bernie sidestepped it.
Do you believe that your economic proposals are enough to remedy the impact of white supremacy, or does institutionalized supremacy deserve its own policies? And then finally, what are you willing to say to your supporters who attack people who ask these questions?
I don't want anyone to be attacking anybody. I just mentioned earlier, we've got to stand together. Okay, we got enough to take on Donald Trump and his billionaire friends and his racism and his sexism and his homophobia. So we don't need to be arguing, we can disagree respectfully, that's fine. Argue respectfully, but we don't need to be attacking anybody. All I can tell you in response to your question is that the agenda that I have brought forth is probably the most progressive agenda in the history of the United States of America. And I can respect that people say, do more. All right, that's fine. But what I have to do is bring forth an agenda that works for working people and at the same time wins an election. And that's what I intend to do. So, if people are unhappy that I am leading the effort for Medicare for all, fine. People are unhappy that I've led the effort to raise the minimum wage to a living wage, $15 an hour, fine. Leading the effort or helping to lead the effort on climate change, taking on this whole broken criminal justice system, immigration system. That's the agenda. You mentioned it. And it's agenda, by the way, with your help, that has helped transform politics in America. Think about it. 4 years ago, who was talking about $15 an hour?
Nobody.
All right? And you know what? As of today, 7 states have already passed that legislation. All right? And the U.S. House of Representatives will do it. So here's the bottom line. It's good to debate. What should we do? What's a progressive agenda? People can disagree with me. But the agenda that I am fighting for, taking on Wall Street, taking on the military-industrial complex, the insurance companies, the drug companies, it is the most progressive agenda in American political history, and I don't apologize for that, okay?
It was a very unsatisfactory answer. So I'm Facebook friends with this guy. I said, were you satisfied with Bernie's answer? And he goes, no. So I said, yeah, I'm surprised. It's like when he went to She the People and he got booed. Now, I thought that was unfair. Why should anybody be booed for saying, they marched with Martin Luther King?
Well, you can't say that you marched with Dr. King and not support reparations. That was the very thing, his last final piece of business that he was working on. That is the reason why he was murdered by the U.S. government, okay? So, no one makes the case for reparations better than Dr. King. There is enough and footage for people to go and get that education to understand. But I think it's going to take an education of this country as a whole, including for Senator Sanders. He also has to be educated as to why and what leads up to that. And I agree with Dina. We are not a monolith. So everything that's listed on the ADOS site I may or may not agree with. I don't want a cash payout with no financial literacy attached to it. That does absolutely nothing for a people who have endured not only just slavery, not only just Jim Crow, but chemical warfare, the murdering and the systematic killing of anyone who would stand up to denounce or stand up for the Black and African American communities. So when you have something like that, where communities flooded with heroin and crack cocaine, when you have that type of chemical warfare, when you have whole armies, planes firing and bombing cities like Tulsa, Oklahoma, when you have those types of instances, and then even today where Black men and Black women are still being lynched in this country like it's 1945, we have to deal with that. And we have to deal with that through education, through ethnic studies, through making people aware that you too come from Africa. You too are one. And so that is there's a lot that is entailed in that, in terms of what reparations actually looks like for someone like me. Land is a big part of it, yes, because you haven't stolen lands, but it's also who is the recipient of that, because there are going to be people who look just like you, Lauren, who say, oh, hold on, I've got an ancestor.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like Elizabeth Warren has Native American ancestors. Well, look, we're going to have to close it out here. Share this stream and keep fighting.